Hello everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Good. So, the title of tonight's talk is The Story of Money, a Buddhist Perspective. And in this talk, I'm going to be asking three questions. How did money come into being? What has Buddhism's relationship with money been? And finally, is money a good or a bad thing? And in exploring the answers to these questions, I hope to bring out issues for us to ponder that bear on our lives as Dharma practitioners and as citizens. They are the importance of gratitude and trust, the use of power, and how we value things. So, first question, how did money come into being? So there's a commonly told story about the origins of money, and it goes something like this. So in primitive times, there was no money. There was just barter. So if someone needed something that they didn't produce themselves, they had to find someone else who did have what they wanted, and crucially, who was willing to swap what they had for what the first person produced. So if the local sheep farmer wanted fish, because we're not talking about a vegetarian economy here, they would have to find a fisher willing to swap fish for sheep. And this system of barter, it said, was awkward and inefficient. You had to find someone who had exactly what you wanted and who in turn wanted exactly what you had got, and moreover, both at exactly the same time. So the story goes, the idea emerged of choosing one thing to serve as a medium of exchange. And this thing could in principle be anything, so long as by general agreement, it was universally acceptable as payment. So in practice, it said gold and silver were the most common choices for medium of exchange because they were durable, portable, and relatively rare. So the local sheep farmer could sell some sheep to whoever and receive in return coins made of gold or silver, which they could then use to buy fish. The fisher could then buy what they wanted using the same coins. And once agreement existed on what this thing was, this medium of exchange, it became desirable not only for its own sake, but also because it could be used to buy other things, and also because it could be used to store up wealth for the future. So this is the story that's usually told of where money comes from. It's a simple and powerful story, but however simple and intuitive that story may be, it is most likely false. It's not true. So if this story is wrong, then how did money arise? And anthropologists tell a different story on the arising of money that throws, I think, a much more interesting light on human society and human relationships. So when I explain this story, I'm going to move around in time and I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a bit. So let's imagine that you and I lived in the past in a small village where people see each other on a daily basis and exist in a long-term relationship with each other. I am aware that you need some wheat, which I have. And maybe out of a simple act of generosity, I decide to give you the wheat. But more likely, I will give you the wheat with the understanding that when in the future I need something else, let's say ham, then you will return the favour. In a sense, I have given you credit and you have a debt to me. And most probably the arrangement between us is just kept in our heads. You are grateful to me for the wheat, and I trust you to repay the debt at some point with something appropriate. So in financial terms, we talk about debt and indebtedness and credit. But actually the key elements in the transaction are generosity, gratitude, and trust. So let's imagine more now that life gets more complicated in the village. So debt and credit still remain the basis for trade between people. Now I want you to imagine there's a local village pub. And when I buy beer, what I've bought is entered on a tab, a record of what I have bought over a period of time. As the saying goes, I run up a tab. And then at some point, I will settle the tab, or I will settle the debt to the landlord. Maybe I will settle the debt with wheat, or with chickens, or with something else acceptable to the pub landlord. This is all described by the anthropologist David Graeber in his book Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And he says there would be numerous such tabs for all kinds of goods and services all across the village. Now I want you to imagine something very different, a big step up in complexity, something like that existed in Mesopotamia in roughly 3,500 BCE. We know a great deal about the Sumerian economy in Mesopotamia because of the preservation of ancient cuneiform tablets that were essentially financial records. The Sumerian economy was dominated by temple and palace complexes, staffed by thousands of priests and officials, craftspeople who worked in their industrial workshops, and farmers and shepherds who worked their considerable estates. And records show that administrators developed a single uniform system of accountancy, a commonly agreed standard for putting a value on different things. And this basic monetary unit was called the silver shekel. And 1 shekel's weight in silver was established as the equivalent of 1 bushel of barley. So, Graeber argues, this particular form of money was not the result of commercial transactions or barter. It was created by temple bureaucrats in order to keep track of resources and move things back and forth between departments. So temple bureaucrats use the system to calculate debts, rents, fees, loans, and so on in the silver shekel. But although the silver was money in one sense, it did not circulate very much. Most of the silver just sat around in the temple and palace treasuries, carefully guarded, literally for thousands of years. So the question arises, why was the silver not divided up into coins of fixed value and circulated? Well, one reason was that whilst debts were calculated in silver equivalents, they did not have to be paid in silver. In fact, you could pay your debts in more or less anything you had around. So peasants who owed money to the temple or the palace usually settled their debts in barley. But it was perfectly acceptable to pay in goats or in furniture or in precious stones like lapis lazuli. As Graeber comments, temples and palaces were huge industrial complexes, and they could find a use for almost anything. So when we look at this example from Mesopotamia, we can see that one aspect of money is that it is a yardstick for measuring debt and giving value to things. So in a village or a small town, if everyone were in agreement on using a common yardstick to measure the value of different things, then we could imagine how another aspect of money could develop. So David Graeber gives an example, I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit. Here's how this other aspect of money could develop. So let's imagine there's a man called Joshua, and he gives his shoes to Henry. And rather than Henry owing him a favour, Henry makes Joshua a written promise to give him something of equivalent value at a later date. Let's say they agree to an equivalent value of 30 shillings. That's the locally agreed yardstick. So Henry gives Joshua a written IOU for 30 shillings. So Joshua could wait until Henry has something useful and then ask Henry to pay his debt, to redeem his IOU. In that case, when the debt was redeemed, Joshua would rip up the IOU and the story would be over. But what if Joshua owes Sheila the equivalent of 30 shillings for something else? And Joshua persuades Sheila to accept the IOU from Henry as payment for his debt. He signs the IOU onto her. And the story could go on. Sheila could now acquire a pair of shoes from Edith, and to pay for the shoes, she can just hand Edith the IOU from Henry and assure her that Henry is good for it. And in principle, this IOU could continue circulating around the town for years, so long as people had trust in Henry's ability to eventually pay the equivalent of 30 shillings. So money is born. I think we're in a position now to see that money is a kind of social technology with three fundamental elements. The first is an abstract unit of value in which money is denominated, like the shekel or the shilling or the pound. The second is a system of accounts, which keeps track of the individuals or the institution's credit or debt balances as they engage in trade with one another. The third is a possibility that the original creditor in a relationship can transfer their debtor's obligation to a third party in settlement of some unrelated debt. So in our example above, Joshua passes Henry's IOU onto Sheila to repay a debt. And this third element is vital. It is the possibility of the transfer of the debt that makes the difference. An IOU, which remains forever a contract just between two parties, is nothing more than a loan. It's a credit, but it's not money. It's when that IOU can be passed on to a third party that credit comes to life and starts to serve as money. Money, in other words, is not just credit, it's transferable credit. It's not enough for Joshua to believe that Henry will be able to pay the equivalent of 30 shillings to settle his debt. Everyone else involved in the transactions must be convinced that Henry can pay his debt. Now, in modern large-scale societies like ours, it's usually only money issued by governments or by the banks, which governments endorse and guarantee, that can meet this third critical element of transferability. They have the power to issue money. They have the power to issue transferable IOUs. So if you look, I've got here from my last visit to the UK 2 years ago, a £10 note on which it says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. This is an IOU, a transferable IOU. It used to be in the past that you could take that to the bank or the government and demand the equivalent of £10 worth of gold or silver. That's no longer the case. If you take that and ask for redemption, they'll just give you another £10 note now. But it's basically, that's a written IOU. That's transferable credit. So I said that governments and banks have the power to issue money. So this raises another important issue, the issue of power and money. So far I've emphasized the role of gratitude and trust in the development of money as a form of transferable paper IOU. But the question arises, what about coins, money as coins, and the development of money with coins? And when we look at this, again using anthropologist David Graeber, we find that the important element in the arising of coins is power, even war. So he explains, David Graeber, how periods of extended warfare made necessary a reliance on the portability of precious metals and created the conditions for the emergence of and widespread use of coins. In particular, the transition to a fully circulating coin-based form of money came as the result of empires seeking to feed and supply increasingly professional or mercenary armies. So faced with the logistical difficulties of coordinating the vast amount of resources necessary for supplying an army moving across considerable distances, imperial rulers devised an ingenious shortcut. They would pay their soldiers in their own specially minted coins, and then they would demand that their new conquered subject paid tribute or taxes with those same coins. So how were the new subjects going to get those coins? The only way the new subjects of an empire could obtain those coins with which to pay their taxes was by selling things to the empire's soldiers. So they're required to sell things to the empire's soldiers to get the coins with which they can pay their taxes. So Graeber says, and I find this very interesting, whilst credit or IOU systems tend to dominate and work very well in periods of relative social peace or across networks of trust, in periods characterized by widespread war and plunder, they tend to be replaced by precious metal and coins. And Graeber argues that the situation in which credit is the foundation of economic life, and money little more than a way of keeping track of it all, persisted for much of early human history, from about 3,500 BCE to about 800 BCE. So that was a credit form of money. Then came what's called the Axial Age. You may have come across this phrase. Sangha talks about it when he talks about higher evolution. And it's in the Axial Age that coins begin to circulate in the way with which we are familiar today. So just to remind you, if you haven't come across it, the Axial Age was the name given by the philosopher Karl Jaspers to the period when the great religions of the world appeared on the scene. So for Karl Jaspers, this period ran from roughly 800 or 900 BCE to 200 BCE. David Graeber's notion of the Axial Age is longer. It gives it a more extended run from 800 or 900 BCE right the way through to 600 CE. And Graeber says, when you look at the Axial Age, it's defined by three linked developments. The turn to coins or metallic money rather than credit money is the first. The second is the emergence of the great philosophies and the great religions, including Buddhism. and Hinduism and Confucianism and so on, and the major monotheisms. That's the second. And thirdly, alongside these two developments, emerged in China, India, the Near East and the Mediterranean, the rise of the deployment of professional armies by the state. So you have these three elements: the turn to metallic or coin-based money, the rise of the great religions and philosophies, and the rise of state professional armies. So Graeber asks, what explains this co-arising of coins, philosophical schools, and religious forms of wisdom and war? So we know a little bit about how the arising of coins and war goes together in order to get payment to the soldiers and get supplies to the soldiers. And with the rise in coin-based money, relationships generally became much more instrumental and commercial. Moreover, Graeber argues, the increased commercialization of life also bred indebtedness and the sale of people into slavery. Because if a person could not pay their debts, then they or members of their family could be forced to become slaves. So in Asia Minor, where Alexander's army required 1/2 ton of silver a day just for wages, in Bronze Age India and contemporaneously in China, Graeber describes the same brutal coming together of coinage, slavery, and state-sponsored armies. As for the third element of the Axial Age, the religious and philosophical schools, Graeber's view is that this new thinking was essentially a reaction to impersonal markets born of war, in which it was possible to treat even neighbours as if they were strangers. In other words, the great religions, the great philosophical schools arose out of a human need, a human response to the growth of impersonal markets. And Graeber goes on to contrast this Axial Age with what he describes as the long Middle Ages, which began, he says, in India between 400 and 600 CE. And according to Graeber, the long Middle Ages ended the military coinage slavery complex of the Axial Age and mended some of the rift between economy and morality, with economic life falling increasingly under the regulation of religious authorities. And this was accompanied by a generalized movement to control or even forbid predatory lending, alongside a return across Eurasia to various forms of credit money. So that's a background to the development of money, from credit-based, trust-based money through to coin-based, instrumental forms of money, quite brutal, and again into the long Middle Ages where we see a shift back to credit money. So the question is, how does Buddhism fit into all this? So at the time of the Buddha, it's clear monks and nuns could not own property and had to live an austere, renunciant lifestyle with a robe and alms bowl as the only allowed personal possessions. Monks and nuns were forbidden to touch gold or silver. And the Buddha also laid down a rule that those wishing to become monks had to first affirm that they had no debts. But whilst Buddhism opposed and rejected violence and militarism, it was not opposed to commerce and had an open attitude towards credit arrangements. And from stories in the earliest recorded teachings of the Buddha, we know that he was not opposed to the gaining of wealth, so long as that wealth was ethically gained and was used for the benefit of others and not just used for individual enrichment. Nevertheless, whilst the Buddha acknowledged the economic and material happiness that could be gained by the layperson from acquiring wealth, he was very clear. Happiness derived from blamelessness, from a clear conscience, brought the greatest benefits. He said, of these types of happiness, the wise know that the happiness of blamelessness, a clear consciousness, is by far the greatest householder happiness. Economic and material happiness is not worth 1/16th part of the spiritual happiness arising out of a good and faultless life. For the Buddha, money and wealth were to be kept in perspective. But what happened after the Buddha's death and as Buddhism developed over the centuries? So what I'm going to tell you now may disappoint you, I'm afraid, because it's not a great story. It certainly disappointed me when I read about this. So we know that in the centuries after the death of the Buddha, the community of Buddhist wandering renunciants came more and more to live the settled life of the monastery. And the Princeton Encyclopedia of Buddhism describes how monastic regulations began to allow the accumulation of donations beyond the immediate needs of the monastic community. Some communities permitted such surplus to be used to endow funds that would generate interest for the purchase of clothing, food, and other community needs, or even for reinvestment. And because the funds generated interest and the principal investment was not depleted, the funds became known as inexhaustible treasuries. And monasteries acquired lands, serfs, livestock, grains, oil, cloth, gold, and silver, and embarked upon a great variety of investment and commercial ventures. We know this from Chinese pilgrims, the reports of Chinese pilgrims visiting India between the 5th and 12th centuries. And they reported that Indian monks supported themselves primarily by practices such as their land holdings and interest-bearing investments, rather than by daily rounds of alms seeking. From surviving copies of Buddhist monastic rules in India dated back to the early parts of the current era, we know that lending at interest was one such practice. The assets lent from the inexhaustible treasury could be commodities such as cloth or food or oils or seed and other goods donated to the monastery. The lendable assets may also have included monies generated from land rents, commercial activities, and investments. The rules for the Mulasavastivada sect of Buddhism even gave specific instructions for lending the inexhaustible goods of the monastery, including details on the amount of collateral required, the form of the contract, the number of witnesses and guarantors needed, provisions for property seizure in the event of forfeiture, and other contractual details. So when we read this, what we see and what we're reading about is a very different world of spiritual activity developing compared to the time of the Buddha. And this was very much the model of Buddhism that was exported to China. Medieval Chinese Buddhism had its origins in commercial exchanges with India. And its earliest form, it was largely a religion promoted by merchants, apparently. And there's some evidence even that the innovation of lending banks in China was introduced by Buddhists traveling from India. The notion of karma was taught with the metaphor of carrying a debt from one life to the next. one way to redeem those debts was to make regular donations to a monastery's inexhaustible treasury and thereby cancel the debts from one's past lives. Not very comfortable with that, I have to say. Reminds me a bit of Martin Luther's revolt against the indulgences in Christianity. And some Buddhist schools even emphasize the debts owed to parents, especially to mother, describing them as impossible to repay, except through donating money to the inexhaustible treasury. Now, it's true, some of the money given to the inexhaustible treasuries would be given to the needy and the poor, particularly in times of hardship, and some would be loaned out. And one practice that occupied a middle ground between charity and business was providing peasants with alternatives to the local moneylenders. So most monasteries apparently had local pawn shops where the poor could place some valuable possession, perhaps a robe, a couch, or a mirror, in exchange for low interest loans. And then there was also a part of the inexhaustible treasury turned over to the management of lay people and either put out at loan or invested for the benefit of the monastery. And as a result, it's described that most monasteries came to be surrounded not only by commercial farms, but by industrial complexes of oil presses, flour mills, shops and hostels, often with thousands of bonded workers. So much so that David Graeber describes Buddhist inexhaustible treasuries as the world's first genuine forms of concentrated finance capital. David Graeber, by the way, was a leading anarchist as well as a world's leading anthropologist. So you have to bear in mind somebody else might have a different view, but I think generally he's correct. He writes, he's talking about the Buddhist inexhaustible treasuries here. He writes, they were, after all, enormous concentrations of wealth managed by what were in effect monastic corporations, which were constantly seeking new opportunities for profitable investment. And when I reflect upon this, perhaps the growth in financial power of these Buddhist monastic complexes and their dependence upon the patronage of rulers may well have contributed to Buddhism's decline in India, with the loss of the intimate daily contact and relationship between monks and lay people that was prevalent in early Buddhism. And from records in China, we know that sometimes the state turned on Buddhist monasteries. And when they did, there's a record of what happened. So in the early 6th century, there were decrees condemning monks for diverting grain intended for charitable purposes to high interest loans. And later in the 9th century, it's recorded that a total of 4,600 monasteries were destroyed, along with their shops and mills. 260,000 monks and nuns were forcibly defrocked and returned to their families. And at the same time, 150,000 temple serfs were released from bondage. So a bit of a depressing picture, but it should be pointed out, not all monasteries in China, we know, behaved in that manner. There's a school called the Three Stages School, and in the late 6th to early 8th centuries, they operated several well-known inexhaustible treasuries, inspired by teachings from two popular sutras, the Flower Garland Sutra and the Vimalakirti Nadesha Sutra. And these sutras emphasize the Bodhisattva's inexhaustible storehouse of compassion for living beings. And with those schools and those monasteries, donations given to the inexhaustible treasury were then lent out free of interest to the poor and needy of the empire. But nevertheless, overall, the history of Buddhism's relationship with money is problematic. Let's leave it at that. It's open to question. So, final question. Is money a good thing or a bad thing? Is it okay if I carry on with this last bit? Yeah? Is money a good thing or a bad thing? So, I've shown how money originally emerged out of human values of generosity, gratitude, and trust. But as its hold on the world tightens, power comes to play an increasing role. But the emergence of money has a deeper effect on human values, and the ancient Greeks understood this very well, and this is evidenced in the well-known myth of King Midas. So there's a book called Money, the Unauthorized Biography by a man called Felix Martin, where he reminds us of the story of King Midas, and he guides us to its key message. So just to go through the story briefly, which you probably know, one day King Midas captures a nature spirit, and to persuade Midas to let him go, the nature spirit promises to grant Midas one wish. And believing that wealth is the best thing a man can have, Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. And his wish granted, at first Midas is delighted. He breaks off a twig and it turns to gold. He picks up a clod of earth and it turns to gold. So he's so delighted with his good fortune, Midas orders a special banquet to celebrate. And this is where things start to go wrong. He grasps a crust of bread to eat, but it turns to solid gold. He mixes wine to drink, but as it passes his lips, it turns to molten gold. And in later versions of the myth, Midas even makes the fatal mistake of kissing his daughter and turning her to cold and inert gold. And cursing his foolish error, he's rich and yet wretched. He sought to flee his wealth and hated but what he but now had prayed for. And he begged the gods to take back their terrible gift. And luckily for him, Dionysius took pity on him and instructed Midas to go to the source of the river Pactolus in Lydia and plunge his head and body into the water to wash away his powers. So Midas did as advised and lost his now detested gift. And in doing so, he transferred the gift to the river itself, which thereby became the source of the gold and silver alloy from which the earliest coins were made. So Martin argues that the central theme of this myth is money's intrinsic tendency to reduce everything to a single dimension. Like the money he craves, Midas's touch reduces the enormous variety of life and nature, the twig, the apple, his bread, his wine, even his fellow human beings and his family, to a single lifeless substance. And where in nature there is a variety of substance, and in traditional society many dimensions of social worth, monetary society imposes an artificial monotony. The Greeks realized that the inexorable logic of money was to put a price on everything and to make everyone think of everything first and foremost in terms of a single dimension. By itself, Martin argues, a universally applicable concept of economic value was in one sense exhilarating, just as it is today. A single metric that can serve as the criterion for any decision does wonders for the organization of a complex economy. But for the Greeks, it was also a source of deep unease. The universal application of the new concept of economic value brings with it a major problem: the lack of any intrinsic limit to consumption, accumulation, and the quest for status. Midas wanted everything he touched to turn to gold, because only then could he be sure that he would be richer than anyone else. Traditional society had intrinsic limits, limits defined by the immutable social obligations owned by peasants to chieftains, chieftains to priests, and so on. Monetary society, the Greeks feared, had no such limits. There's no intrinsic limit to the accumulation of wealth. And since status in monetary society is by its nature relative, not absolute, monetary society constantly risks degenerating into an unending one-upmanship. And what is even worse, the Greeks feared, the lack of a limit to the imperative to get money may lead to a lack of limits to what people will do to get it, will put enormous pressure on ethics. In this respect, Midas was a special case. Opportunity fell into his lap. But in the real world, the incentives to try anything to get unlimited wealth would surely, the Greeks feared, be unlimited as well. And the impact of excessive accumulation, consumption, and competition for status remains a widespread concern today. The tendency to put a monetary value on things governs more and more of our lives. And Felix Martin concludes, there is a paradox at the heart of money. It is a social technology which depends on other people. Yet it is a social technology which isolates us from other people by transforming the rich and varied ecology of human relationships into the mechanical and monotonous clockwork of financial relationships. And this is the challenge that faces us today. Money arose out of the values of generosity, gratitude, and trust. And those values came to be dominated by the use of power by states and other institutions, even by religious organizations. So this is something we can ponder. How do we, and I don't have easy answers to this, I'm raising the question for something to us to ponder. How do we preserve generosity, gratitude, and trust in our lives as individuals, as part of a Sangha, and as citizens, as part of a wider collective society? And perhaps the greatest challenge for us is the danger highlighted by the myth of King Midas, the creeping monetization of more and more of human life, and the corruption of the true human value of things. So I'm leaving those as issues for us to ponder. And as I say, I don't have any easy answers, these things, but I think these are issues that lie at the root of the crisis in modern human society. So I'll finish there. Thank you.